You saw it early, not at the end, not after months of confusion. At the beginning, the hesitation, the inconsistency, the way something didn't fully line up. It wasn't obvious enough to walk away immediately, but it was there. A small moment, a slight shift, something that made you pause internally. And instead of listening to that pause, you explained it away. You told yourself it wasn't a big deal, that you were overthinking, that you needed more time to understand it. So you stayed, not because it made sense, because you didn't want to act on what you already felt. You recognized it, but you didn't trust it. It didn't come as a clear warning. It came as a feeling, a subtle internal signal that something wasn't fully right. Maybe it was the way they responded. Maybe it was the lack of consistency. Maybe it was how you felt after certain interactions. Slightly off, slightly unsure, not enough to justify leaving, but enough to notice. And that's where the mistake started. Because instead of trusting that initial recognition, you questioned it. You told yourself you needed more information, more clarity, more time. You turned to something simple into something complex. You moved away from instinct and into analysis. And once you did that, you lost your anchor. Because now you weren't responding to what you felt. You were trying to explain it. You talked yourself out of what you felt. This is the part most people don't realize they're doing. You don't ignore the signal directly. You reinterpret it, you soften it, you reframe it into something more acceptable. You say things like, maybe they're just busy. Maybe I'm expecting too much. Maybe I just need to be patient. And those thoughts feel reasonable. They feel mature. They feel like you're giving the situation a fair chance. But what you're actually doing is overriding your initial reaction. You're replacing a direct signal with a narrative that allows you to stay. And the more you do that, the quieter your instincts become. Not because they're wrong, because you keep dismissing them. You gave it more time instead of making a decision. Time becomes the excuse. You tell yourself things need to develop, that you can't judge too quickly, that you need to see more before you decide. And that sounds logical. But in reality, you're not using time to gain clarity. You're using time to delay a decision you're uncomfortable making. Because making that decision would require you to act on something that isn't fully proven yet. It would require you to trust yourself without complete certainty. And most people don't do that. They wait until it becomes undeniable, until it's obvious, until it hurts enough to justify leaving. But by the time it reaches that point, you've already invested more, you've already attached more, you've already made it harder to walk away. You started adjusting yourself to make it work. Once you decide to stay, something shifts. You stop observing the situation and start adapting to it. You adjust your expectations. You lower your standards slightly. You become more flexible, more understanding, more patient. And again, it feels like growth. It feels like you're being mature. But what you're actually doing is accommodating something that didn't feel right from the beginning. You're changing your response to match the situation instead of evaluating whether the situation should remain. And the more you adjust, the harder it becomes to recognize how far you've moved from your original position. You've done this before. You've been here before, not in this exact situation, but in this pattern. You saw something early. You felt something that didn't fully sit right. You questioned it. You gave it time. You adjusted yourself. And then eventually it became clear. Not because you figured it out, because it repeated enough times that you couldn't ignore it anymore. And when that clarity finally hit, it felt obvious. It felt like something you should have seen sooner. But you did see it sooner. You just didn't act on it. That's the pattern. And until that part changes, the outcome doesn't. You stayed until it became undeniable. Most people don't leave when something feels off. They leave when it becomes undeniable, when the pattern repeats enough times, when the inconsistency becomes obvious, when the misalignment becomes too clear to explain away. And by that point, it's not a decision anymore. It's a reaction. You're not choosing to leave. You're forced to, because the situation no longer supports the narrative you created to stay. But the cost of waiting that long is that you've already invested more time, more energy, more emotional attachment. And now leaving feels heavier than it would have earlier. You confused patience with ignoring the pattern. Patience is not staying in something that doesn't feel right. Patience is allowing something that aligns to develop. But when you apply patience to something that's already showing signs of inconsistency, you're not being patient. You're being passive. You're allowing something to continue without addressing it. And over time, that passivity becomes a pattern. You get used to not acting, to waiting, to observing without responding. And that creates a gap between what you see and what you do. You lost trust in your initial response. Every time you override your initial instinct, you weaken your trust in it. You teach yourself that your first reaction isn't reliable, that you need more information before you can act. And over time, that becomes your default. You stop responding early. You wait, you analyze, you delay. And that delay is what allows the pattern to continue. Not because you don't see it, because you don't act on it when it first appears. This is why you keep ending up in the same situation. It's not random, it's not bad luck. It's not that you keep finding the wrong people or the wrong situations. It's that you keep responding to the early signals in the same way. You see them, you question them, you delay acting on them. You adjust instead of deciding. And that sequence leads to the same outcome every time. Not because the situation is identical, but because your response is. You don't need better judgment, you need faster action. You're not misreading things, you're not missing signals. You're seeing them. The issue is not recognition, it's timing. You're acting too late. You're waiting until it becomes obvious instead of acting when it first appears. And that delay is what creates the cycle. Because by the time you act, you're already invested. This is exactly why you don't need more clarity. You already had it. Early. Before things got complicated, before you became attached, before you started adjusting. What you needed in that moment wasn't more understanding. It was discipline. The ability to act on what you felt without needing it to become undeniable first. The ability to hold that decision even when it felt uncomfortable. That's the shift. Not seeing it better. Acting on it sooner. You saw it, you just didn't move. You're not confused. You're not unaware. You're not missing anything. You saw it. You recognized it. You felt it early. You just didn't act on it. And because you didn't act, it continued. It developed. It repeated. Until it became something you had to react to instead of something you could have prevented. That's the difference. Not what you saw, what you did with it. And the moment that changes, everything else does too. Thank you for watching. This is MindStickz,